difference like, like the sound of the previous one.
Yeah, except that.
We'll get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Gavett, who's here from New York. I think almost all of you were at the concert last night, which was outstanding. And Jeff has, I suppose, built a particular reputation for working with microtonality, both as a soloist and also with the vocal ensemble that he runs at Melos. So I asked him today to talk specifically about his approach to microtonality in the voice and tuning systems. They've done crazy stuff like St. Gesualdo in 31 tone equal temperament. And one of the things I've always found really fascinating about Jeff's work, he's sung my solo piece 20 times, maybe?
A lot, yeah.
Maybe more than that. And the group has done my ensemble piece. And he's done a really great job of documenting the process of learning that work, both in terms of the rhythmic material, pitch material, etc. And has a really interesting blog that's quite open about the kinds of techniques that he uses for learning challenging repertoire. So a good match for, in particular, the pitch component that kind of runs, the microtonality component that runs through the year. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you, Aaron. I thought that I would begin by just sort of talking about how I got into this world, because my, like Aaron said, much of my approach today is going to be about how I deal with this music as a performer. Like, I'm not a theorist, I'm a performer and a composer, and I sort of had to come at this music in a practical way and find out, how am I going to deal with these specific challenges. What got me interested in this world in the first place was, for my undergraduate education, I was at Westminster Choir College in Princeton, New Jersey, and as the name implies, very ensemble, singing focused education. And whenever we would begin singing a piece, rather than playing a chord on the piano for everyone's reference notes, someone would get a pitch from a tuning fork or a pitch pipe, or they would play one note on the piano. And I asked at some point, like, why are we just giving the one note? And they said, well, we'll be more in tune if you just have the one note than if everyone has their reference pitch from the piano. I thought, like, well, if the piano is not right, I'm like, what is right? And that's sort of what got me going down the rabbit hole of interest, especially in just intonation. Because of course the piano is your reference. If you're a singer and you're learning some mid-century serial piece, like, you're going to be checking your notes all the time on the piano because the intervals are so nasty. But this idea that, especially in ensemble singing, equal temperament is incorrect or suboptimal was really interesting to me. So the question comes, how do you know, first, what is in tune or what is right in different situations, and then how do you know if you're right or not? What's the frame of reference? Because I've always been interested in just, trying to get as close as possible to the score and the composer's intentions, and not knowing what is our desired outcome is very difficult. So a lot of my work in microtonality has been figuring out ways to both learn the piece and sort of verify that I'm actually doing what the composer is asking for. My first real experience in singing something with a lot of quarter tones, and that's my first experience in microtonality as well, which I assume is common. That's sort of like the stepping stone into that world. was in 2008 I sang in the US premiere of the full version of Xenakis' Oresteia. I sang in the chorus for that, and it's sort of a very simple, the chorus part is this simple kind of quasi-folk use of microtones. And the only way that I had to work on, let me just show you a little bit of a quaddy scan of the score here. You see we've just got this sort of modal, let's see if I can move the screen here. We have a very simple kind of modal thing that just sits around this one pitch center, and the only way that I had to work with it at the time was to just play it on the piano and try to sing the note that wasn't the notes on the piano, and try, which is not the best way to work on things, as you might imagine. So let me, I will be using throughout some really like horrible, nasty synth sounds, which is my preference in working with learning microtones. Let me just see that we're not crazy loud. So I just use like nasty sawtooth wave things, which I'll talk about some of the reasons for. But so this, this Xenakis thing, if I just had the piano, I would have to, uke ho prosika, I know it's not supposed to be said, it's not supposed to be said. So it's, just try and find something that feels equally terrible against both notes on the piano. Which, like I said, it's a way of doing it, and if you actually, I'll just sort of exaggerate for the purpose of demonstration, but I'll sort of waver around, and you can see if you can hear when we reach a point where it's beating equally against each one of the notes, or as close to equally as we can find. So just trying to find something that feels as wrong as it can feel was the original, that was the only option that I had at the moment. So I worked with that, and the piece is also, this is a Unison Chorus for these sections. So we had a whole, 16 men who were all working with a rehearsal pianist who was saying, no, it's not this, go in the middle. But I wanted to find a better way of hearing this, and it seems to me that the best way to deal with it was to deal with it the same way I would 12-note music, and that is get a way to play my notes. And so I started to use just this very rudimentary synth setup. So I'm just using like a really old version of Reactor and some soft synth setup that they have, and just with a couple little tweaks set up something to be able to play microtones for myself. So something that's easy and possible with any soft synth setup, but like I said, this is sort of very rudimentary. They have like a fine tuning knob, and I just set the range of it to be a semitone, and the number of steps that the tuning knob had to be 2. So if I just press up or down here, I retune it by a quarter tone up or down. So that was my first approach, is to just use a MIDI keyboard and just retune the thing by a quarter step up or down, which worked well enough for this Xenakis piece because we're all unison, there's only one line happening. The issue with working specifically this way is that if I had harmonies, and I I can't retune the individual voices. I'm just retuning the synthesizer as a whole, up or down. But let me switch over to the Xenakis again here, and you can see how much nicer it is to. It's much easier to deal with actually hearing your notes. Go figure. The issue of polyphony is something that I'll deal with in the more sort of advanced systems that I've been using as we go along. But this is the basic way that I tend to work with quarter tones now. Sorry. So I have this little cruddy MIDI keyboard that travels with me everywhere to be able to work on microtones, and I've set up the pitch bend on it to be just within a quarter tone up or down. So rather than having to with my keyboard go up or down, I have a button here where I can. It's a little more intuitive for me, I found. I've also worked sort of in the same way with eighth tones. So just further equal tempered divisions of the octave can be dealt with in a similar way. A quick sort of conceptual note, I'm not sure everyone's familiarity with it or like how equal temperament is put together, but just as a contrast to when we get to the just intervals and the sort of simple way that we can relate pitches, equal temperament is kind of gnarly, the way that we have to divide the octave into equal sounding parts. We perceive pitch logarithmically in relation to frequency, meaning each octave doubling. So we go from A440, the next octave A is 880 or 220 below. So that means that there's a distance of 220 hertz there and a distance of 440 hertz, but we hear it as the same. So to perceive these equal divisions, the math gets kind of nasty. So the ratio between each of the adjacent semitones in 12-note equal temperament is the 12th root of 2. So that means quarter tones are just 24th root of 2. So the math doesn't get any nicer, and the intervals don't get much cleaner. But let me show you an example here from a piece that I've worked with eighth tones, and it's by Evan Johnson. It's a piece that he wrote for my ensemble Load Bang. It's called My Påvart and Going Over, and it has all this sort of small filigree microtonality around certain interval. Let's see if I can make this more legible for you. Great. So the first way that I dealt with this was in sort of the exact same system that I dealt with this before, and I just set up 4 equal steps for the division of this tuning. So we have those are eighth tones up and down around the single pitch. And in Evan's piece, this is actually a pretty practical way to work because of the way that he handles pitch in it. You have all these little arrows. The arrows up indicate the sort of a very small microtonal division, and then we have our traditional quarter tone accidentals on the C and the B there. So let me just get this so I can play it. prefer working with these sawtooth waves because something that's overtone rich is easier for me to match pitch to, and to sort of just go basically by feel, knowing that I'm either in a perfect unison with this synthesized sound or not. Sorry, my tea is leaking near my computer. Right, so it's not a great solution for performing something that has lots of quick changes in tuning, because I'm having to press, if I have to go from an 8th tone sharp to a quarter tone flat, I either have to sort of switch around accidentals in my head and play a different note on the keyboard, or I have to press this up and down arrow 3 times or something. So it ends up being pretty impractical for anything that's actually complex. Let me show you a piece of mine that doesn't work particularly well with this kind of setup because of these same challenges that I mentioned. And I'll show you. So here the arrows indicate 8th tone alterations and traditional quarter tone accidentals. So it's fairly fast, and it jumps around to these different tunings. So if I were to try and play it, ground is awful. Sorry. If I were to try and play it, it gets a little messy. Join So I have to, there's a lot of thinking and moving around on this side. Like this is a piece from years ago that I've sung a bunch, and I can't quite do it on this because this isn't the kind of way that I would work with the piece because of the specific way it goes through the pitch material. As we get to further and further divisions of the octave, it gets less and less practical to work with retuning specific fixed notes on the keyboard up and down. So I've worked a bit with 72-note octave tuning systems, and so if you actually, you'd have to have 6 up or down arrows to try and go between all your options, and it ends up being totally impractical. But instead tends to work with some software that allows me to retune the entire keyboards to any pitches that I want. So totally abandoning any correlation between the keys that I'm pressing and the sounds that I'm hearing for the purposes of being able to more fluently play an example. I'll just show you a little piece of software that I use for this and how it works. So this is called CSE. It's just a scale editor for a piece of microtonal synth software that I use. And you can see on the left MIDI notes in, on the right MIDI notes out, and note names. And then we have a visualization of the keyboard along with cents. The 1,12 marking there means that this note is going to be the first of 12 equal divisions of the octave. So it's very easy to hear 12 equal temperament, But if, for example, I were doing a piece in 72 and I wanted to just redo some of these for you. It's a very, very quick and fluent way to work with it. So you can see what it's retuned to: 16.67 cents, 33 1/3 cents, 50 cents, 66.67. So. And it's very easily retunable to any kinds of setting, any kind of equal division of the octave or any kind of just division. And after creating this scale map in this software, there's a separate synthesizer software that reads these mappings that I set up that will allow me to play in them for you. So that's me playing chromatically on this, but instead of a semitone, each is a 12th tone. So in some ways that's a lot more practical, and in others it's terribly impractical because the whole keyboard fits an octave and change at that point. And this fits, I have a major third in my 2 octaves here. So I've gone to a kind of like tablature transcription model working with pieces where there's just a ton of pitch material to deal with. Like I performed an arrangement of Barstow by Ben Johnson for the arrangement for string quartet, and it's this incredible quantity of just intonation pitches to deal with. And what I ended up doing is writing out all of the pitches that happen in the piece and then sorting them from lowest to highest and then mapping those to a keyboard that I had, just from the lowest pitch to the highest pitch, and then essentially writing a kind of tablature transcription that included the pitch that I needed to play on the keyboard to hear it, and then another staff with the sounding pitch. So sort of like a mapping of scordature or something. Let me see if I can bring up an example of that. So I'll show you a piece that I also used this solution for. Piece by a Boston composer named Julia Werentz, and it's a 72-note octave piece again for my ensemble load bang. So we have accidentals for 33, 16, and what is it, 50? And 50 cents in each direction. So, and it sort of noodles all around and has these big intervals and jumps, and the only way that I could deal with it conceptually was to just totally transcribe it into that kind of tablature notation. In terms of equal temperament, in my experience, 72 is kind of an end game that nobody, there's Carrillo stuff that goes into the stratosphere in terms of numbers of notes in the octave, but I don't really know of people working a lot in equal temperaments above 72. A nice thing about 72 is that it approximates some just intervals well. So the smallest division that 72-note octave can represent could, for example, take a C and an E and lower that E to approximate a just 5/4 major third, or the second smallest division, the 33 cents, could take a C and a B flat, lower that higher B flat to approximate a 7/4 just seventh partial relationship, and the quarter tone can raise a perfect fourth, C to F, quarter tone to approximate an 11/8 ratio. Incidentally, that's the only more acoustically consonant interval that you get in quarter tones. In 24-note equal temperament, you get a better tritone. But nothing else comes closer to approximating just relationships. 72 does a good job of that. There are also non-12 multiple equal temperament divisions that are used. 31 approximates some intervals in just intonation fairly well. You get good major thirds and good just sevenths with 31. The only problem is you get kind of gnarly fifths. They're really flat. That was the main challenge, and Aaron had mentioned that my vocal ensemble at Camelas worked with performing some Gesualdo in 31-note equal temperament, and it's very difficult in ensemble singing to sing those narrow fifths, because if you've sung in choirs or in vocal ensembles, you know that sort of feeling of the ringing wide fifth is what you go for to lock in tuning. We chose to sing the Gesualdo in 31 based on some sort of historical conjecture on my part. There's a great book, I can't remember the author off the top of my head, it's called Enharmonic.
Patrizio Barbieri.
You got it.
We have it in the library.
You should all check it out. You read, obviously. Yeah, and it's this sort of incredible historical tour of tuning and temperament. And he talks about Vicentino, who's an Italian composer a generation before Gesualdo, who worked on extending the mean tone system to be able to modulate into distant keys, essentially, and be able to play in a good in-tune mean tone system far out. So he ended up building this harpsichord and organ with many, many keys per octave, but it was really theoretically working towards 31-note equal temperament, sort of without realizing it. He ended up very closely approximating that. And a copy of one of those keyboard instruments was brought by a composer in Gesualdo's court, Scipione Stella, I think his name is. And so we know that Gesualdo had, access to these instruments that were built to be in this tuning. So I just thought, well, maybe he sat down at these keyboards and heard what his music sounded like at that, with these big enharmonic shifts, so C sharp and D flat wouldn't be the same note. But talking about approximating just intervals, I want to move into speaking about how I work with learning just tuned microtones. So as opposed to equal tempered divisions of the octave, the theoretical basis for which is, as I said, the xth root of 2 generally, if you have an octave repeating equal tempered scale with a certain number of divisions. So for example, 12 or 24 for 12, or for 12-note equal temperament or quarter tones. Quick note, there are equal tempered systems that don't repeat at the octave. They're pretty interesting. Bolin-Pierce scale repeats at a just tritive. So it's the 13th root of 3. So 13 equal steps that repeat over a just perfect 12th. There are clarinets made to play in this system specifically because of the fact that they are lacking the overtones, that they're lacking the even numbered overtones, so it naturally wants to sit in that kind of just 12th system. But back to just intonation, we're working instead with ratios of frequencies. That's generally relating ratios of frequency with small whole number ratios if we're working on things that are tunable by ear. And the theoretical basis for it was easiest for me to grasp thinking about the overtone series. So let me just pull up a little example here that I made for a microtonal ear training course that I was teaching. So we have this low contra C as a fundamental, so we can call that our first partial. C an octave above that as the second, so the relation between them is 2 to 1. Then we have the third partial. It's a 3 to 1 if we relate it to the fundamental, or 3 to 2 if we relate it to the second partial. So it's conceptually very straightforward that this is the fifth, and that's the fourth, so between them is 5 to 4. And if you look at the frequencies and are very good with mental math, you can see how they're related. So this is the basis of how I thought about just intervals in beginning to deal with them. Like, what the hell is a 7 to 5? It's like, okay, it's seventh partial and fifth partial, so it's this tritone between the lowered seventh and the lowered fifth partial. It means that rather than the 12th root of 2 defining a semitone, we have a whole range of possible semitones in just intonation, but 16 to 15 is a common one. And if we're going purely based on the difficulty of the math that you're looking at, you can see that 16 to 15 is a lot easier to deal with than the 12th root of 2. And I've used a similarly wide range of softwares to deal with just intervals. One of them, we can deal with the get this on my screen for a second so I can see it. In this scale editor, I can show you something. It's a mystery what's happening. So, similarly to how you can put in these parenthetical instructions in the software, I can also just put in ratios, which by some quirk of the program it likes to have backwards. So this we have our tuning note, our 1-to-1, and then a 9/8 just major second, and 5/4 just major third. So I can tune any possible combination here. If I wanted to have both a 5/4 major third and 8164, which is also called Pythagorean ditone, I could very easily have them by one another. So I'll set up either a tuning map in this that actually corresponds to the keys, depending on the way that the piece is put together, or I've also done this sort of tablature approach that I mentioned before. The limit with this is that it's we end up with a fixed system. I have a certain number of keys and I have a certain number of notes, and if I want to change it around, I have to program a new one of these or open up a different file. So if I want to be working in several different tuning systems or have more notes than are practical to deal with in one keyboard's worth, I have some better solutions. Specifically, I've worked with some software developed by Canadian composer living in Berlin named Mark Sabat. And he has this tremendous, what he calls this 31 limit just intonation calculator and organ. So I'll see how much of this I can fit onto your screen here. So, I'll move a couple of other things. This is my favorite tool to use for learning microtones at the moment. It's also incidentally free and super powerful. You can get at his website. So we pick a tuning note that will act as our one-to-one. Generally work with A440, and then can very easily select tunings for different notes. So this lattice that we have in the top with natural sharps and flats, and double flats and sharps, is 3 and 5 limit relationships. So relationships of perfect fifths and just thirds. And then the next row, you see that has a 7 next to it. That accidental in his system indicates the 7th partial relationship. That is based on notation by Tartini when he was working with difference tones systematically for the very first time. And then we have a sort of traditional looking pardon me, quarter tone accidentals for the 11th partial. And this is the way that his system of accidentals works. That for each new prime number partial, we have a different accidental. So if, for example, I wanted a simple A major diatonic scale tuned justly, like sometimes called Ptolemy's intense diatonic, we have our one-to-one for an A. I select the B. His system assumes Pythagorean tuning, so fifths are good throughout, which I find more intuitive than Ben Johnson's system of microtonal accidentals, which assumes C major, Ptolemy intense diatonic. So between D and A in his system is not a perfect fifth because the A is tuned as a lowered third to the F. So D and A plus or A and D minus in his system is a perfect fifth, which I think is a nightmare for singers and I assume for string players also.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So Sabat's system assumes Pythagorean tuning, so we don't need to change anything to have this B be a 9/8 because it's assumed that it's related by 2 perfect fifths from our tuning note A. Then for C sharp, we want not, if I just have C sharp, like I said, it assumes Pythagorean tuning, so it would be 8164. You see he has sense difference from equal temperament here, and then we have sense to MIDI and lots of useful things to copy into other software.
Ben.
Sorry?
Sorry, no. Just marveling at this.
Yeah, it's a fun toy. So instead we select this C sharp with a lowered arrow, which indicates a 5th partial relationship. D we'll just have as plain old related by 5th to A, D. E similarly, F sharp will again have lowered G sharp as a major third to our E. So let me turn on the organ component here and just give you an example of what we just put together. So we have our A. If we were to go up in fifths just to demonstrate, perfect fifth, no beating. Again, up to our B, 9/8, it's another perfect fifth. That wide whole step, I always think of like Bulgarian women's choirs or something with that kind of whole step that feels very strong and consonant. And then with our D, we have a perfect fifth as well. To add our C sharping, depending on your experience with this or if you have background Renaissance music, maybe it sounds a little low, but let me just give a quick demonstration here. So we have that's our just tunes triad, so you can represent that as 4 to 5 to 6, the frequency ratios. It's very simple. But if I go, that's equal temperament. And that's just tunes. So it's a very, all of a sudden that thing that has been the main thing that you've probably listened to your whole life sounds like hot garbage. So that, yeah, there's a great, that's my favorite button on this synthesizer is press T to compare with equal temperament. and then quit. Yeah, so this is just for your edification, the organ setup. So it's like a drawbar organ synth setup. So depending on what kind of work you were doing, if you needed specific timbres to hear how the intervals sounded different, with different timbral components of your sound, it's very easy to do with this synthesizer. Something else that I love about this is the flexibility to, I wonder if I can get the screen any bigger. There's something at the very bottom of the screen that I want to show you. It's so far away. Let me see if this works. Evidently his laptop is bigger than mine. Okay, so you can change the pitches that will result depending on the velocity of the MIDI keyboard. So if I wanted to be able to play very easily this, like I said, maybe let's see, if I wanted for some reason my D to be able to play the 7th or an 11th partial instead, it'll automatically go to the nearest MIDI note, but I'll change it to go to the D instead at low velocity. So if I play it firmly, I can't see what I did. Maybe I didn't do it yet. And if I set to low velocity, you see clear accidentals, which is very useful. So with the same keys, you can play any different pitches. So it's very useful, depending on the complexity of the music, and if you have, a real weighted keyboard rather than this, it's a little easier to play your velocities precisely. But you can't take a MIDI keyboard in your backpack on the plane. It's fully weighted and 88 keys. So this is what I have. It also has the flexibility, not just in terms having different pitches on each note, but on also having a variety of presets that are very easy to work through. So, for example, let me just start with this preset that I have, which is for my friend Taylor Brooks' piece that he wrote for us, called Motorman Sextet. It's a half-hour microtonal unaccompanied piece for 6 voices that's really, really tremendous. And while he writes, he notates with 72-note octave accidentals. He's always working with the just intervals, and the notation is sort of to show you the closest equal-tempered notes that you're deviating from. And occasionally he'll write in sense difference to tell us very specific things, but it's usually clear the relationships that he's making. The issue with setting up a synth reference for this piece is that it changes very, very rapidly between different tuning systems and different sounds. So for example, in the very beginning of the piece, it's this sort of very clearly A overtone chord, like, so it's our tuning note, the fifth, so the third partial, fifth partial, seventh partial, 11th partial. And then we sometimes get 13 also. But he'll move very quickly away from that to, there's a section that follows in the piece that builds a kind of Pythagorean scale, but instead of using perfect fifths stacked out in each direction to get your notes, he uses just sevenths stacked on top of each other. So you end up with this very, very strange sort of one-dimensional tuning lattice in seventh partial relationships. So to be able to switch between all these in rehearsal, to be able to play and check things as we go, this is then incredibly useful, because if I just, my pitch bend buttons here, you'll see on the bottom, cycling through different presets. So I can instantly go between any of the many different sections for tuning in his piece, and all of these have any different, as you heard, any different kind of mapping. So this is the sort of weird septimal Pythagorean thing, and it's been a really invaluable resource for working on this kind of music, especially in an ensemble setting, where it's not just me shedding notes at home, but it's, you know, we're on a time schedule, we're on a deadline, we have to know what the whole thing sounds like together. And instead of the sort of rudimentary retuning one note by cranking this pitch wheel up or down, we can sort of very, very clearly work in any number of tuning systems immediately and polyphonically and clearly. Let me show you a little bit of Taylor's score, just so you can see where this kind of work is useful, and also to shamelessly plug Taylor, who is an awesome composer. So, resize this a second. There we are. Okay, so just to see his accidentals alongside the give this to the part so I can play it for you. See his accidentals alongside the sound of it. So this is in the very beginning of the piece, it's sort of the main chord of the piece. We have our A, then we have a C natural that's raised, so adjust minor third relationship. And then we have in the countertenor the 11th partial, and the mezzo, the perfect fifth, and the soprano, adjust seventh. We have these sort of various little sort of undulations around those pitch centers, and with the complexity of a sound like that, it's been so important for me to have a real reference, and to not just like, well, we sing this C high and then this is a quarter tone, and then, you know, hope for the best. Can really hear where we are. You know, the simple relationships that we get to are by ear, but when you mix sort of overtone and undertone tunings, you get into very nasty spaces very quickly that are much harder to intuit and find that. Show you quickly how he notates that sort of bizarre Pythagorean section that I was mentioning. So at this point, he ends up working instead with sense difference and then accidentals that approximate the closest equal tempered pitch to what he's working with. And again, with this software, we can easily, accurately tune it and sort of check our work, as it were. This is one of the most challenging tuning pieces that I've come across in just intonation, and I want to talk about sort of in what feels like an entirely different category from either just intonation or equal tempered microtonality to me, and that's dealing with glissandi. Let me pull up.
Sorry, just one question.
Certainly.
Do you have a recording we could hear briefly, just to have them?
Sure. Yes.
It would be nice to hear some excerpts, just
Certainly.
to have an impression how it sounds at the end.
Yes. Let me pull up
Yeah.
part of the premiere. So this will be from the very beginning of Taylor's piece that I was showing you with the with that sort of thing happening in it. They kept him in a crumbling house, a building with structural moans, whose eaves cracked in summer heat and gathered winter ice. At that point, Moldinki's chest held 2 lungs and a single heart. He experienced a shortened boyhood, a small degree of youth and carelessness. Most phenomena puzzled him and sent him on aimless walks among the leafless ether trees. them, casting frightened earthward glances. He would press his face against the pane of his bedroom, look out as spring fell, and wait for the green bird. The green bird would circle the dying ether, peck spirals on its dry trunk, writing down its habits, behaviors, and essences.
Followed by pauses, long natural tongue, pulling on the jelly-like substance.
So there's a little sample of the piece that's recording of the premiere. Yeah, you see how he tends to work with both very clear consonant structures and then sort of there's usually one or two things sort of going against it and making it a little less clear. There was a little example of glissando in that one. I just wanted to talk about the sort of special challenges of working with glissando. Briefly, those of you who were at the concert last night heard Martin Idden's piece, Ampelos, and it's entirely glissando, with the exception of these sort of short interjections that puncture the lines. And to boot, it's mostly between quarter tone pitches. So the way that that I worked with this was a combination of different softwares and setups, but mostly it was a sort of very simple approach, which was working with any kind of synth software that would easily give me a drone to work with, some sort of harmonically rich drone. Let me show you. And then playing my pitches above that. So material in the piece is from the end of Josquin, Neuf des Bois, and he transposed it and smashed all the intervals by a factor of 2 and then just essentially I'm arpeggiating the parts of this piece of Josquin polyphony, and the key that he transposed it to would, like, the piece would be in E. So working this way, even though I didn't know how he put together the thing. I found these relationships that helped me to learn it. And I've actually performed the piece with a drone as well, because with all the other parts in the speakers are just glissando, it's very easy to totally lose your bearings. We also performed a piece by Martin that, let me show you, called Hamadryads, which was our very first collaboration, which is very hard to search for on my computer because the file name is in Greek. And don't know how to type in Greek on my computer. But this is a case where the composer has dealt with the sort of challenges of the tuning system as part of his conception of the piece. So here's part of Hamadryads. So it's for 5 voices. The numbers and lines across the top indicate tuned wine glasses that we're playing at certain points. But it is, again, consisting entirely of glissando between pitches that have Pythagorean relationships to their previous pitches, but instead of staying within a system like you would if you were actually performing Josquin in some sort of Pythagorean tuning, it just spirals off in one direction, sort of into infinity, so it gets more and more and more distant from the original pitches as you go, and often the glissandi are over a quarter tone over 30 seconds or something. So it becomes kind of totally impossible to know where you are at all, pitch-wise. So the way that Martin conceived the piece is that all the singers would have headsets with a sine wave gliss that we would be tracking throughout the piece to be able to handle the pitch material. And I like that as a solution with a piece where that's the conception of it. I feel like if that's not the way the piece is put together, it can have a distancing effect. It can sort of isolate the performers if they have to have something in their ear the whole time, which doesn't matter as much for me with the solo piece because there's not real chamber music happening. It's all me on the recordings, and I sing pretty well with me. But yeah, this piece was conceived specifically with this method of performance in mind. I'll play you just a little excerpt of this so you can hear sort of how far it goes in what it does. That reference throughout the sort of totally unmoored approach to pitch through glissando. We're going to quarter-till. Great. So I've been talking so far basically about rote learning tools, sort of simple playback tools, and there's another category of those that I've worked with a lot, and that is making sort of full computer versions of pieces. So rather than making a tuning system that I can play back or being able to play one thing at a time, to create a whole computer performance of the piece that is properly tuned. And that's actually how I approached working with Taylor's piece, Taylor Brooks' Motorman Sextet. So I'll show you some of that. Are there any Sibelius? So as you might guess what I use for a sequencer, yeah, Sibelius. Does anyone have any questions before I sort of move on to this next section of the talk? Great. Jump in if anything comes to mind. So let me play you sort of especially gnarly part of Taylor's piece that I worked with. So to create these full realizations of the piece, I began by just sequencing the notes, the closest 12-note equal temperament notes in Sibelius, and just sort of pounding through the whole score and putting it again back into notation software again. So it's kind of a brute force method that just takes a lot of hours of putting the thing together. But my thinking was always that the many hours of assembling this kind of tool will remove way more hours of rehearsal time that is needed, because we'll already know to a degree what things need to sound like. So we'll know, again, like I said at the beginning, like, are we right? What is right? And then we have some reference to go back to. So let me show you in Taylor's piece the section that I'm about to play. It's an especially challenging moment in the tuning that involves some very big shifts. And is also, incidentally, another spot where he marks sense difference in the score. To give us a more specific relationship between the parts. So let me play right about there. And you'll also note, similar to the synthesizer sounds that I'm using, that in full realization I use really, really terrible sounds. Partly for the tuning and partly because MIDI sound sets, when you retune them, sometimes they get really funky and they don't actually retune properly, or the timbre gets very weird. And I've found that the reed organ setting on general MIDI works perfectly retuned for some reason. So that's what I use. Another New York microtonal person, Toby Twining, who's a Ben Johnson student who has written some really incredible and incredibly complex just intonation vocal music. He uses the fretless bass sound in general MIDI, which apparently also retunes well, but I find is not as easy to match pitch to. So let me show you this realization here. anyhow, that's what I force the singers in my ensemble to listen to. But what I like about doing full realization is that you get both a sense of the way that all the verticalities in the piece work, and you also get a sense of the sort of absolute relationships of these drifting and shifting centers. And I don't have perfect pitch, so for me working with something like this helps me to develop a kind of both aural and kinesthetic memory of where the pitches lie. Let me see if I can quickly find for you the human recording of that section for to hear. I think that'd be interesting.
And down the slide.
intrepid bass Steve, whose range and capabilities I love being able to use and abuse. So I've also used in my composing some tools for sort of complete playback and reference. Specifically in using Open Music, made use of their wonderful micro player software. Let me pull up some sketches from the load bang piece that I was showing you earlier. We can compare realization to the recording as well. So in working in Open Music as part of composing the pieces, having this reference to actually hear all of the microtonal variations that I was working with were invaluable. So let me just show you what the sort of this is, it's ugly and I haven't made it look nice because this is not the part of it that's for human consumption, but you can see what the playback of it sounds like and how it works. anyhow, their software works totally seamlessly with the rest of the sort of composing tools that are part of the software suite, and I found very useful in assembling that. Let me see if I can play a little bit at the beginning, and then give you the human version. I have a couple last sort of special cases of ways that I'll work with full computer realizations. One is with dealing with both microtones and a piece that doesn't have a traditional rhythmic notation. Open up. Another piece that you heard last night. Show you what Juan Communius's piece looks like, and then describe how I worked through it a little bit. So the piece is totally spatially organized in terms of time, and then at various points going back through the material, it's to be performed at a different ratio to the original rate that you performed the material through the first time. And so in dealing with how I was going to learn this piece, I decided that I was going to sort of measure the score very exactly. In some ways that I've worked with cage scores, measured out and worked with timings, deciding that the page is a minute, and then working with a timer to be very specific about it. With this, I actually worked in in this software right here and measured can't see what I'm doing over there. Here we go. If you work with the inspector, you can measure the distance between can measure the distance between pitches very accurately. Well, I did this a little while ago and I forgot how I did it, evidently. But if you select it, you can see how many pixels are between each note. And I noted the distance exactly between all of them, pixel-wise, made a list of that, made a list of all the pitches as MIDI note names, and then sequenced everything in Super Collider using the distances between the notes as the duration, and then going through and dealing with the different multiples as they came. And that way I was able to create a realization that would be proportionally correct, and I could also scale it to be whatever length I wanted the piece to be. So I scaled it to be 6 minutes total. But once I had all that information, it was easy to shift it around. We just have a few minutes left. Wondered if anyone has any questions about software that I've been using with composers, or dealing with this as a singer. Any questions at all? Mary, you promised me questions.
I have so many, but but yeah, it'll get nerdy quickly.
Yeah. Well, let's do it. We got 4 minutes.
Yeah. All right. I just have a general question about the method that you use, which is basically the one that I've concluded is the best for strings as well. But it has to do with the method is based on like the idea of pitch matching, right? So either pitch matching unisons with something that you've mapped here, or maybe pitch matching based on other simple audible relationships, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Have you come across any methods of tuning microtonally where they're not primarily based on pitch matching as the device that you use? No?
Not reliable ones, I don't think. I mean, I've done things where there's just sort of there's nothing that's tunable by ear going on in the piece, and then I tend to function on just like pure kinesthetic memory of where the pitches sit and the relationships between them, which is not super reliable, obviously. No, I think there always has to be either a real or imagined relationship between what you're doing pitch-wise and some other fixed, reliable thing.
Right.
So I'll sometimes go through, like with Ampelos, Martin's piece that is in E for me. If I'm singing a complex microtonal ensemble piece, it will usually be in a key for me, and I'll go through and I'll highlight or mark if it's in A, I'll mark all the A's and E's. And then every time they come up in the score, I notice them and I hear them, and I just refresh the memory of that reference. And then having that sort of imaginary drone throughout that is occasionally articulated by an instrument or another voice is what I tune to.
Right.
But yeah, for me there has to be some kind of reference.
So is it fair to say that you're tuning low ordered ratios to pitches which are either sounding or unsounding at any given time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, tuning
Great.
as simply as possible. I mean, sometimes it depends on the pitch content of the piece. Like I'll do that kind of tuning to an imaginary drone in like a Charles Warren piece or something.
Right.
So then I'm not tuning low order relationships. I'm just tuning 12 note equal sort of scale degrees.
Right.
But yeah, there's always at the beginning of working with non-tonal music and working with microtonal music, I was thinking I have to get this away from tonal reference, and the more I've worked with it, the more I think that it's actually the way that I should work in it is a similar conception to tonality, that we have this a base, we have a reference throughout that we can go back to and deviate from, but there's always a reference, because otherwise, it's hard to know where we are.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone?
I'm curious about the ensemble setting and what happens when this lands in front of, say, eight singers. Tuning in even the most conventional settings with 8 singers is challenging for all sorts of reasons. And I'm just kind of curious how the ensemble deals with it. You've told us kind of the practical side of how they deal with it. I'm sort of curious about the personal,
the emotional
side
yeah.
of you want me to do what?
Yeah, I mean, luckily my ensemble has been doing this for 5 years, so they're used to me asking a lot of them, and they're very adventurous. People prepare outside with these realizations or however they want to prepare. And the most recent big Microtonal thing we did was Ben Johnson piece called Songs of Desolation that he wrote for Swingle Singers. And when we worked on that, we just we tried to sing it all together, and then we figured out what was, where we couldn't hear where we were, and then thinned out the texture and worked with simple relationships, worked from the lowest, worked from fundamentals in terms of the tuning system, and then went up to higher order, higher prime relationships as we got in tune with the lower ones. It's always about tuning to bass notes, tuning to fundamentals, and sort of taking things apart to make them as simple as possible. Like making sure the fifth is ringing before we put the third in, before we put the seventh in. It's sort of traditional, in some ways it's a lot like working with traditional ensemble singing. It's just it's more specific in different ways.
And so one slightly hairy question, which is about the role of vibrato in challenging intonation systems with, we're talking about often really small sound deviations.
Right.
Well within, already some of them within the critical band, and then definitely within vibrato,
right.
Easily.
I think it depends on the composer and what they want from dealing with tuning like this. Like Julia Werntz is a Boston composer. I know that there are a lot of people in that scene who are writing 72-note octave music who say like, no, of course you play with vibrato. Of course you sing with vibrato. That's like part of the sound of it. Like it's just that, you're 13 cents, off, but you're, that's the middle of where your vibrato is or whatever. That's just part of the sound of the instrument. And some people are dogmatic, super straight tone, which can be, there are vocal difficulties involved depending on the sort of range and technical challenge of it. We tend to sing with a little vibrato. It's just, how most of us like to sing.
I mean, in an interesting way, with the question then becomes what constitutes a note as a singer, and so one option is that it is that it is the middle,
right,
of the vibrato, but it becomes like a kind of ontological question. What I imagine that's true in your world as well.
It's interesting because in string technique, like they always teach you that the note is at the very top of the vibrato.
Oh.
So you always hit you hit the note as you reach the top.
Huh.
That's how violinists, that's how classical violin technique is taught to tune, right? So in this case, like if we were going to vibrate, which I know some people with some strong opinions about that, but probably you'd try to hit the note at the top, but especially because like with a string it's a bit, well, it's not different really, but we've got such a blunt thing that we're trying to hit such a small spot.
Yeah.
I think it would maybe to an even greater extent obscure the sound of the pitch on the string.
Mm-hmm. If you were around the pitch rather than, or you mean vibrato in general?
Well, vibrato in general, but certainly I think if it's the middle, you wouldn't be able to hear it at all. I don't think on a string. Like it must have something to do with the sound identity, but I don't know why that is.
Yeah, I didn't realize that about string playing. That's interesting. Whereas vibrato in voices is sort of, it's usually a thing you don't talk about.
Oh.
In training, it's sort of like if you don't have a vibrato, or if you have an ugly vibrato or a weird vibrato, you talk about it. But otherwise, it's just like this is part of what happens when you do all the other things you're supposed to be doing with the voice. Except for certain specialized fields of vocal practice. Some kinds of ensemble singing, there's just never any vibrato. You never use vibrato, but then that can be a technical limitation if you want to work in other fields. But yes, it's a very, very hairy issue, you're right. Vibrato. Anyone else?
Time for maybe one more.
Anything.
Well, I was just wondering about your practice when you're using those saw tones and all that stuff. I thought about doing something with musicians as well. Also, string players having like an earplug and trying to tune up the. But I always think I can't do this with the musicians. How do you think about that personally? If you do it, after a while it must be terrible for your ears and must be terrible for.
It's actually Martin's piece Hamadryads is a sine tone throughout.
Yeah.
So it's 17 minutes, and we're hearing, throughout, and it's actually hard to keep. It's hard to perceive pitch after a little while. When there's no variation and there's not starts and stops and it's gliss.
Yeah.
At a certain point in rehearsal, I realized I'm like a fifth off. I'm a professional musician and I can't match pitch at this moment. Just because something about hearing it just in one ear for a really long time messes with your perception of pitch. And actually one of my singers who has perfect pitch refuses to do the piece anymore because it messed up her perfect pitch for like 2 or 3 days because she couldn't match the thing, she couldn't hear it, and she didn't know what pitches were anymore. Just because hearing this constant, really slow gliss just like broke her briefly. So no, I think you have to think about fatigue not just in terms of like pain, but in terms of perception and cognition. Because if you just that kind of information is not the way that we normally hear pitch.
Yeah.
But ask people. That's always the right thing to do. Anyone else? Thank you so much for coming and for your attention.
Jeff, thank you.